Good morning, how are you today? Well, I hope that you're doing all right and you're holding up in these days. Over the next few weeks, we're going to dive into the Old Testament and explore three of the minor prophets and see what they have to say to us. So we begin with the prophet Habakkuk, and it's a short book of the minor, which most of the minor prophets are, but it shows how despair and faith can be both experienced at the same time or at different times by the faithful of God. Now, we all go through times of victories and times of valleys, and often in our victories, it's there we find it easiest to worship and celebrate who God is, for his goodness is evident all around us and his blessings abound. But the valleys are the harder times when we can connect and maybe celebrate who God is. And currently we're in a time of isolation, a time of uncertainty. There's deep concern for others, and some of us will be even experiencing grief at this time. Whatever that valley is, it's hard maybe to trust in the goodness of God when all around us seems hopeless. Now, Habakkuk, this minor prophet, he learned to trust in the faithfulness of God even in the deepest valley. Now, he was in the nation of Judah. It was in economic and spiritual despair at the time, and all seemed helpless. The valley was deep, with no end in sight. In fact, Habakkuk knew there was a terrible situation. It was going to get even worse before it would get better. And we can learn from this dark valley that he was in about how to draw near to God in our loss, our anxiety, and in our fear. So in those times of trouble that he faced, and in these times of uncertainty that we face, we might well be asking the question, Lord, how long? How do we respond in these circumstances? I wonder, do you ever confront God? Do you get frustrated with him or angry with him? Do you have questions and doubts? Well, firstly, I want you to know that that's okay. It's perfectly normal to act and to feel that way. But if we look at Habakkuk, maybe there's something we can learn today. Firstly, he pours out his heart. Now, names are important in the Bible, and this prophet's name, Habakkuk, means to wrestle. And here we find him wrestling with God. In fact, he's the only prophet whose main focus is to be in conversation with God as opposed to waiting and then addressing the people. Habakkuk issues his complaint before the Lord about the utter destruction that is happening in his country. He wrestles with the God throughout the entire book, asking the question, God, are you good? So this is his first complaint. We'll look at it in Habakkuk 1 verses 2 and 3. He says these words, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds around me? Why must I watch all of this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence, and I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight." So this is the beginning of Habakkuk's lengthy grievance with the Lord. He continues with this list of objections for almost 2 chapters. Now his country, Judah, is in economic and spiritual ruin, and Habakkuk wants to know what the Lord is going to do. Does he even see about it? Does he care about their condition and their plight? So he pours out his heart, pours out his hurts before God, the God of all. Have you done this? Have you cried out to God? What do you cry out for? What's the answer that maybe you're looking for? Well, in his wrestling with God, Habakkuk receives the initial response from God that he will rescue his people. Hooray! However, this is going to be done through the Babylonians, and this wasn't the expected answer. In fact, Habakkuk is really angry with God, suggesting that this was the right way to solve the crisis and deal with the injustice. But you see, God was doing something behind the scenes that would not make sense to his people at the time. Yes, he was raising up the Babylonians, who were a sinful and ruthless people, to bring judgment upon Judah. But it was in this instance, he was working on the holiness of the people before their happiness. Ultimately, although Judah could not see it, he was working for the expanse of the gospel and the good news to the unreached world. So I wonder, are you ready for God's answer to your cries, even if the answer is not as you'd expect or one that we can comfortably accept? So after pouring out his heart, Habakkuk then waits on the Lord. And we read at the start of chapter 2 these words, that I will climb to my watchtower and stand at my guard post. There I will wait to see what the Lord says, how he will hear my complaint. Now what he does here, Habakkuk, is to model a really important spiritual discipline, that of waiting for the Lord. Now the idea of a prophet waiting on the Lord was nothing new. They waited for God to speak a message to them that they would then give to their people. In this case, Habakkuk was not just waiting on a prophecy, but waiting on a reply from God, the God who cares about the needs of his heart. And he finds that God answered the cries of his heart concerning the nation of Judah. Therefore, if we ask God the question, we should wait for an answer. How often, I wonder, do we express our frustration, our anguish and anger to God, and then just go about our day without waiting to see if God will actually answer us? We may find the answer to our circumstances if we discipline ourselves to wait on God. And after waiting, here is the answer Habakkuk receives. Write my answer plainly on tablets so that the runner can carry the correct message to others. The vision is for a future time. It describes the end and it will be fulfilled. If it seems slow in coming, wait patiently, for it will surely come. It will not be delayed. So we find that Habakkuk then chooses trust over bitterness. He puts the Lord at his word and trusts in his sovereignty. Throughout all of chapter 3, he pours out of his heart, but this time not in cries and anguish, but in praise before the Lord. He constantly reminds himself of God's goodness, his power, his holiness. And it's clear that this is a heart of worship. He says these words in chapter 3. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, and the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. As he remembered the history of God's faithfulness to his people, Habakkuk knew that he could trust in the Lord. He knew that the God who provided manna in the desert would one day provide bread of life. He knew that the God who redeemed the Israelites from slavery would one day rescue his people from the bondage that they were in. God has proven himself faithful and true, and Habakkuk resolved himself to remind himself of God's goodness and poured out a heart of worship despite the circumstances he was in. And so as we close, let's just take a lesson from Habakkuk. When we consider the areas in our lives where we cry out to God, I want you to be assured today that just like God heard the cries of Habakkuk, he hears your cries and my cries. He sees the heart, the hurt, and he draws near. He comes to surround us with love and with goodness and remind us of all that he is. So just like Habakkuk could look back on the faithfulness of God to his people, I pray like you, like I, can look back on the goodness of God to my own family. His track record of his faithfulness, that his heart is kind. He was kind enough to send Jesus to rescue me from my bondage of sin and death. He was faithful to continue his work in making me more and more like his son Jesus, in the victories and in the valleys. I can testify that God has never left me nor forsaken me, and he is redeeming all things in my life, in the world, for his glory. So we can trust the God who has proven himself faithful throughout all creation. Habakkuk could not see what God was doing, but ultimately we see the expansion of the gospel now throughout the world. We can be confident that he is working out all things for the good of his people and his glory. No matter your circumstances, your loss, your anxiety, your fear, know this, that the creator and sustainer of life cares for you. In your hurt and in your waiting, he wants your heart. He wants your heart poured out. And Habakkuk did not choose bitterness. Instead, he chose to run to our faithful God, to run to him. So may you run to him today. Pour out your complaint. Wait for the Spirit to draw near. Seek him in his word and preach his promises to your heart. Choose worship over worry. And even if not, he is still good. May we be blessed today as we take these words and this lesson from Habakkuk. May God be with you. God bless.